Nikki. And thank you for being here this evening. And thank you, Philosophy Sharing, for organizing this. As Nikki said, the title of this talk is Crisis and Hope, two themes which are very dear to me, and I have been, researching and reading about for the past years, but in the past months they became a bit more central to me, and this is an ongoing research. And today I'd like to present some of the ideas I gathered through these past years, months as well. As we all know, this century has no shortage of crises. Wars displacing millions, political polarization turning neighbor against neighbor, pandemics that can shut down the world overnight, technology advancing faster than our ethics can keep up with, accelerating climate shifts, disrupting ecosystems and human livelihoods alike, and in general, a pervasive sense that the old certainties no longer hold. It can feel at times as though the ground itself is giving way beneath us, and yet, across history, moments like these have always carried a double edge. Crisis unsettles, yes, but it also discloses. It shatters what we thought was secure, yet it opens a space where new possibilities can emerge. But what prevents us from succumbing to despair when our familiar world falls apart? Where does hope originate when reason wavers, when fate becomes uncertain, when history itself seems to turn against us? This evening I intend to explore how such questions have been addressed by different philosophers across the centuries, demonstrating how crises have repeatedly sparked new and yet recurring forms of thought, and how hope has persistently refused to fade, even in the darkest times. My aim is not to provide easy solutions, but to ask, what lessons can these voices from the past teach us about living, thinking, and hoping amid our turbulent age? To do this, I will share some philosophical insights into the relationship between crisis and hope, at times accompanied by famous artworks, by drawing on key moments in the history of philosophy that shed light on this complex bond. In doing so, I also hope to show that we can discuss hope on various levels, whether privately, as a personal experience, or publicly, as a collective phenomenon. When I was asked to select an image to accompany the publicity of this evening's talk, Rembrandt's 1633 oil on canvas painting came to mind. I believe this powerful image shown here perfectly captures the essence of what I'm here to discuss. If you observe closely and attentively, you can see a moment where crisis and hope are intertwined. Although the feelings of despair and fear immediately stand out, dominating almost the entire scene, with the waves threatening to destroy the boat and topple the restless figures within it, you can also detect subtle hints of hope already present within the scene. For instance, this is evident in the variations in color tonality in the sky at the top edge of the painting, as well as in the facial expressions and gestures of the figures, some of whom appear calmer and more courageous. Moreover, the image of the anchor comes to mind, an ancient symbol of hope, which is not visible here as it lies hidden beneath the waters. But perhaps that is precisely the point. Hope is often hidden, yet it steadies us all the same. It can be helpful to briefly clarify the basic terms involved. A crisis is generally perceived as a time of significant difficulty or danger, whereas hope involves maintaining an open and trusting mindset. It's important to note that hope isn't the same as optimism. In fact, hope exists beyond the binary of optimism and pessimism. Hopefully, by the end of this talk, this becomes clearer. Something that amuses me is examining the etymology of words, which, as you know, is the study of their origins and how their meanings have evolved over time. As shown in the slide here, the origin of the term crisis, which is Greek, highlights the idea of choice, whether through cutting, splitting, or sieving, it emphasizes the point at which change must occur in order to overcome a current state of unrest. A crisis can occur at the institutional, economic, political, religious, global, or personal level. What usually follows is a solution that can restore stability both now and in the future. Regarding hope, its original meaning involves a sense of expectation combined with trust and confidence. In Latin, the word is spes. As previously noted, the opposite of hope is not pessimism. Pessimism is the opposite of optimism. Instead, the opposite of hope is despair, as the etymology of the word clearly indicates. From Latin, despair derives from desperare, combining de, without, and sperare, to hope, from spes. As we will see, many philosophers have insistently argued, hope is not mere wishful thinking. Rather, it is an anticipation of something good. Like crises, it can be understood on various levels, be it institutional, economic, political, religious, global, or personal. However, unlike crisis, which is predominantly a noun in most languages, hope functions both as a noun and a verb, representing action as well. As we shall see, this active component is central. One of the first things that came to my mind when penning this talk is the famous phrase, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." The phrase is inscribed at the entrance to hell in Dante's Inferno, the first part of the Divine Comedy written in the early 14th century. In Dante's vision, hell is not terrifying only because of its punishments. It is terrifying because it is a place without hope, a realm where change is impossible, where no beginnings can break in, where despair is eternal. If hope is the trust that tomorrow can be different from today, then hell is the place where tomorrow is condemned to be the same forever. And perhaps, in our own lives or in our societies today, we too often create our own little hells, spaces where we convince ourselves that nothing ever can change. Another painting that truly captured my attention while I was preparing for this talk is Evelyn de Morgan's Hope in a Prison of Despair. It beautifully illustrates the tension between feelings of despair and the enduring light of hope. As you can see, the artwork shows a woman confined in a bleak, restrictive space, symbolizing how despair can feel suffocating. Philosophically, it highlights an important idea. Hope isn't about the absence of crisis, but often exists right within it. The painting suggests that hope remains a vital lifeline, a form of inner resilience that keeps the human spirit alive even in the darkest times. De Morgan's vivid depiction encourages us to see hope as an act of rebellion against despair, as proof that hope isn't naive optimism, but a brave acknowledgement of potential beyond our current pain. It reminds us that hope's true strength lies in its refusal to be extinguished, even when we feel trapped in a prison of despair. In Greek myth, when Pandora opened the fabled jar given to her by the gods, it released all the evils. Yet the jar is not completely emptied. Something endures. One thing remains inside: hope. We might ask, if the jar contained evils, then why was hope within the jar, amongst such evil and suffering? If hope was an evil, then why not allow it to be released with the others? Did it remain in the jar to be preserved, or did it remain in the jar to be kept away from us? Hope, being the only blessing remaining in the jar, symbolizes our hope that not all is lost, that through labor and suffering we are able to overcome evil. The myth of Pandora is more than a warning against reckless curiosity. It is a nuanced reflection on the human condition. Philosophy, as we all know, often begins when moments of crises intersect with moments of hope, when difficult questions emerge from disruption and the pursuit of truth sheds light on the way forward. Here I'd like to share another famous and beautiful painting titled The Death of Socrates by Jacques-Louis David, a French artist renowned for his neoclassical style. This artwork powerfully illustrates the link between crisis and hope. One immediately notices the sharp contrast between the gesture of despair of the man handing over poison to Socrates and Socrates' calm and hopeful stance while sitting on, quite literally, his deathbed, as he prepares to drink it, aware that it will lead to his death. Even in death, Socrates remains hopeful in his philosophical commitment to truth. His acceptance of his fate expresses a deep hope that through justice, in a higher sense, will always prevail, beyond any earthly court. Socrates lived during a time of political turmoil. His relentless questioning caused an intellectual crisis as he uncovered contradictions in people's beliefs, prompting them to reconsider their assumptions. The so-called Socratic method is in itself a form of crisis. Yet, it also offers hope that through honest self-examination, one can pursue truth and live virtuously. The death of Socrates led to Plato's own philosophical crisis, a moment that demanded a deeper search for justice and truth. Many Platonic dialogues began with a problem or conflict, a sign that philosophy starts in the discomfort of not knowing. Plato uses the crisis of Athens in justice as a springboard for the Republic's vision of the just city and the philosopher king. His famous allegory of the cave, illustrated in the following engraving, indeed embodies hope. Even if people live in darkness, they can ascend to the light of truth. Hope here entails that through proper education, the soul can be oriented or reoriented towards the good. To this end, it can be said that philosophy offers a path through reason, dialogue, and contemplation of eternal truths towards knowledge, virtue, and the good life. Even though philosophy is born out of crisis, through the shattering of assumed certainties and the confrontation with death or injustice, it refuses to end in despair. Instead, it transforms crisis into hope. The hope that truth exists, that the soul can ascend towards it, and that a just life is possible even in an unjust world. Resonating with all this are Augustine's ideas. Once again, I'm presenting another powerful allegorical painting, this time by Thomas Cole, titled The Course of Empire, Destruction. Some of you may have come across this image before. It depicts the chaotic decline of a grand civilization, reflecting themes of transience and the cyclical nature of empires. In The City of God, Augustine intricately weaves hope into the vision of history, human destiny, and fate, portraying a pilgrim city that travels through the ages towards ultimate fulfillment in eternity. When Rome fell in 410 CE, the empire that had seemed eternal crumbled in fire and chaos. Panic swept through the ancient world. If Rome could fall, what could be trusted? Many lost faith not only in the empire, but in the very idea of order and stability. Augustine responds with a reordering of history. All electricities are destined to rise and fall. While the collapse of Rome shook the foundation of an entire civilization, Augustine proclaims that the city of God cannot be toppled by armies and undone by ruins. It is invisible, indestructible, and eternal. In light of this, for Augustine, hope is never nostalgia. It does not gaze backward with a bittersweet longing for the past. Hope looks forward. It stretches forward. Augustine knew the strength of hope, and he also knew the misery of its absence. A man without hope is only a shadow. He no longer lives but merely survives, numbing himself with fleeting pleasures and silencing his anxiety with shallow distractions. Against this shadow, Augustine sets hope as the very light of human existence, the power to endure, to act, and to walk as pilgrims towards a homeland that cannot fail. And yet, hope is not an escape from the present world. On the contrary, hope gives us our mission, to spread hope, to transform the world we inhabit. In a world sick with hostility and despair, hope is never withdrawal, but a call to action. This is not hope as passive waiting, but hope as resilience, a force that refuses despair a virtue that drives perseverance, courage, and moral action in the present. Hope orients the pilgrim beyond the cycle of empires towards a destiny where no collapse could reach. In times of crises, Augustine insists hope is not naive denial of suffering, it is the very strength that transforms suffering into pilgrimage, chaos into witness, exile into longing for home. Of all the paintings, this is probably the most notorious one, at least for us Maltese, not because of its content, but because of the backstory behind the actual work of art. In 2020, the Maltese government repurchased this painting at an auction in New York for 1.3 million euros, 2 centuries after it mysteriously vanished from the Grandmaster's palace in Valletta. The painting captures a moment of haunting intensity. The Roman philosopher Boethius, condemned to torture and death by order of Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths, sits imprisoned in the shadows of despair. Once a trusted statesman, now branded a traitor, he awaits his brutal end under false charges of conspiracy. In this silence, Lady Philosophy, the radiant personification of wisdom, appears not to spare his life, but to rescue his soul. Like Socrates before him, Boethius faces execution not as a criminal, but as a philosopher whose pursuit of truth threatened the powerful. Both men, shackled by injustice, turned their final days into dialogues that outlived their persecutors. Here, Mattia Preti immortalizes the very instant at the opening of Boethius' final work, The Consolation of Philosophy, penned during his imprisonment. Stripped of honor and freedom, Boethius turns inward to confront the ambiguities of fortune, free will, and fate. It is a scene not of triumph, but of defiance, philosophy itself standing steadfast in the face of death. In The Consolation of Philosophy, it is notable that Boethius approaches hope somewhat differently from Augustine. While Augustine grounds hope in God's revealed promises and eternal destiny, Boethius considers hope as part of the human struggle to understand fortune, virtue, and the ultimate good. Augustine views hope as forward-looking toward a promised divine future that transforms present living. Boethius, on the other hand, sees hope as stabilizing the present through rational understanding of the eternal order, which in turn controls any fear of the future. He develops this idea through his dialogue with Lady Philosophy, who reminds him that everything is ordered by the divine mind, even when everything appears chaotic. She warns him that placing hope in worldly wealth, honor, and power ultimately brings about despair, since they are inherently unstable. Boethius reminds us that the wheel of fortune turns without warning, crushing all who cling to its rim. The only true lasting object of hope must be the summum bonum, the highest good. Boethius comes to realize that true happiness comes from aligning the will with the divine order, which cannot be taken away by imprisonment or death. Once Boethius accepts that nothing happens outside divine reason, he regains hope, not in escaping his cell, but in participating in the summum bonum through virtue. Initially, Boethius' hope is a desire for reinstatement, vindication, and survival. However, by the end of his book, his hope is purified and transformed into a confident trust that the soul can attain the highest good and share in divine happiness, regardless of external circumstances. Such hope serves as a beacon of light in times of crisis. Boethius becomes a bridge between the classical world and the medieval mind, preserving the rational spirit of antiquity while offering a vision of order and meaning that shaped medieval thought for centuries. His Consolation of Philosophy was widely read through the Middle Ages, serving as a model for how reason and reflection could bring inner stability in times of crisis. The medieval world was swelling with new knowledge, the rediscovery of Aristotle, the rise of new sciences, the expansion of human curiosity. And with that expansion came a danger, a fragmentation of meaning, a disorientation of the mind. Reason must not end in confusion or pride, but must ascend beyond itself, from the external world of creation, inward through the senses and the intellect, and finally beyond all finite grasping, into the radiant unity of the divine. The mind can rise above the turmoil of fortune by seeking higher truths. To this end, the human mind is not crushed by crisis. Rather, it is provoked into a journey. But this journey cannot end in reason alone. It must culminate in the fire of a divine truth. However, as philosophy transitioned toward modernity, the question then shifted and turned on reason itself. What can reason truly know at all? In the Critique of Pure Reason, published in 1781, Immanuel Kant, one of the central thinkers of the Enlightenment, draws the boundaries of human knowledge, demonstrating that while reason can organize experience, it cannot extend beyond it to ultimate reality. Where Augustine and Boethius saw the journey of the mind leading to transcendence, Kant marks the moment when philosophy turns towards the conditions of thought itself. Here, we encounter a different crisis. The old metaphysical systems had collapsed under the weight of skepticism. Religion no longer served as an unquestioned foundation for knowledge or morality. Kant writes how reason can no longer promise us metaphysical certainty, but it can still guide us morally. It can still give us hope, or grounds for hope, that freedom, justice, and the highest good are not empty dreams. Kant wrote not only about the crisis of reason, but also about moral, political, and epistemological crises. But what does he have to say about hope? Anyone familiar with his major work must at some point in the later stages of the book encounter this theme. In the section referenced in this slide, Kant writes the following: "All my reason's interest, speculative as well as practical, is united in the following three questions. 1. What can I know? 2. What ought I to do? And 3. What may I hope?" He notes that the first question is merely speculative, the second is purely practical, while the third is both practical and theoretical. For Kant, hope centers on the idea of happiness, much like knowledge centers on understanding the world through natural laws. Just as we look for causes behind what is, we also look for reasons behind what ought to be. For Kant, this leads to the concept of a highest good, a state in which moral goodness and happiness are perfectly aligned. He imagines a moral intelligence, a will that is both perfectly good and powerful, that ensures happiness is given only in proportion to one's moral worth. This harmony of morality and happiness is what Kant calls the ideal of the highest good. And quoting Kant from the same work, he writes, "God and future life are two prepositions that, according to principles of pure reason, are inseparable from the obligation imposed on us by that same reason. Morality in itself amounts to a system, but happiness does not, except insofar as its distribution exactly commensurate with morality. This, however, is possible only in the intelligible world, under a wise originator and ruler. Reason finds itself compelled either to assume such a being, along with life in such a world, which we must regard as a future world, or to regard the moral laws as idle chimeras, because without these presuppositions, the necessary result that reason connects with these laws would have to vanish." And another quote here, the same work, "Hence," Kant writes, "without a God and without a world that is invisible to us now, but is hoped for, the splendid ideas of morality are indeed objects of approbation and admiration, but are not incentives for our resolve and for our carrying out these ideas. For they do not then fulfill the entire purpose which is natural for every rational being and which is determined a priori and made necessary by that same pure reason." Ultimately, Kant's critical philosophy aimed to establish the foundations of knowledge. His task was to secure reason against skepticism. For Kant, the great crisis was to set boundaries for reason, to show what we can know, what we ought to do, and what we may hope. Out of this crisis comes a new kind of hope, not in metaphysical certainty, but in the moral realm, where freedom, duty, and the ideal of the highest good provide meaning to human life. But more than a century later, Edmund Husserl, the Austrian-German philosopher and mathematician who founded phenomenology, saw that very project collapsing. In the 1930s, as the Nazis rose to power, he diagnosed a new crisis. Reason has lost its meaning. Detached from the life world, rationality itself risked becoming an empty mechanism, unable to guide culture or resist barbarism. Where Kant asked how reason can ground hope, Husserl had to ask whether reason could even survive. He saw firsthand Europe turning against its own claim to reason and humanity. Husserl diagnoses the loss of meaning when science becomes detached from the life world. But he's also warning of what happens when a culture abandons truth, spirit, and reason in favor of ideology and violence. For Husserl, the crisis was not only political, but spiritual. Barred from teaching and publishing in Germany because of his Jewish ancestry, Husserl found himself silenced in the very country where he had shaped generations of philosophers. Yet in 1935, he was invited to give lectures in Vienna and Prague, places where he could still speak openly. These lectures were more than academic occasions. They were Husserl's opportunity to remind Europe that philosophy still mattered, that even as barbarism spread, the spirit of reason was not extinguished. From these lectures came his last and most urgent work, titled The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology. In it, Husserl insisted that Europe could either collapse into despair and rationalism or be reborn through a renewed commitment to philosophy. It was a final attempt to rescue meaning at the very edge of catastrophe. Husserl insisted with great passion that philosophy was not an academic luxury, but a matter of survival. It is within this context of Europe descending into irrationalism that he called for a rebirth of spirit through philosophy. His 1935 lectures in Vienna and Prague were a cry against barbarism, a plea to rescue meaning, truth, and the very idea of Europe before it was too late. This is how Husserl ends his 1935 Vienna lecture. The crisis of European existence can end in only one of two ways: in the ruin of a Europe alienated from its rational sense of life, fallen into a barbarian hatred of spirit, or in the rebirth of Europe from the spirit of philosophy, through a heroism of reason that will definitely overcome naturalism. Europe's greatest danger is weariness. Let us, as good Europeans, do battle with this danger of dangers, with the sort of courage that does not shirk even the endless battle. If we do, then, from the analytic conflagration of disbelief, from the fiery torrent of despair regarding the West's mission to humanity, from the ashes of the great weariness, the phoenix of a new inner life of the spirit will arise as the underpinning of a great and distant human future. For the spirit alone is immortal. Like Husserl, Gabriel Marcel, often regarded as the phenomenologist of hope, despite his classification as being an existentialist, recognizes the same crisis that marked the 20th century he lived through. However, he refuses to view it merely as a problem to be solved. Instead, he interprets it as a call to adopt a different mode of being, one rooted in fidelity, communion, and an openness to transcendence. In this perspective, hope does not deny fragility, but transforms it, serving as a lived act that connects us to others and to the potential for renewal, even amidst cultural and personal breakdown. While Husserl's crisis describes the disconnection of reason from the life world, Marcel perceives the broader cultural moment as a spiritual crisis characterized by alienation, objectification, and the loss of genuine communion. In this way, Marcel enriches and reinterprets the phenomenological project, demonstrating how recognizing crisis can itself serve as a call to rediscover hope grounded in shared embodied existence. I would like now to share some of his insights from his renowned work titled Homo Viator, Introduction to a Metaphysic of Hope. In the first place, hope is only possible on the level of the us, or we might say of the agape, and that it does not exist on the level of the solitary ego, self-hypnotized and concentrating exclusively on individual aims. Thus, it also implies that we must not confuse hope and ambition, for they are not of the same spiritual dimension. We cannot help seeing that there is the closest of connection between the soul and hope. I almost think that hope is for the soul what breathing is for the living organism. Furthermore, he also writes, he who hopes, inasmuch as his hope is real and not to be reduced to a mere platonic wish, seems to himself to be involved in some kind of a process. And it is only from this point of view that it is possible to realize what is specific. And I should add super-rational, perhaps also super-relational in hope. For to use once again the expression I've so often employed, hope is a mystery and not a problem. The truth is that there can, strictly speaking, be no hope except when the temptation to despair exists. Hope is the act by which this temptation is actively or victoriously overcome. Marcel, like many other philosophers, emphasizes the stark contrast between optimism and hope. Optimism is linked to the probabilities, favorable trends, and positive forecasts. It relies on external conditions and tends to fade when those conditions deteriorate. However, hope, in contrast, can endure even when there is no reasonable expectation of success. It is not based on calculation, but on a deeper commitment to life and meaning. Ultimately, for Marcel, hope is existential. It comes from the core of the person, not just from external reassurance. It involves readiness, engagement, and sometimes sacrifice, which means that to hope is to stand firm, to keep faith with a possibility that may not yet be visible. Marcel also highlights that hope often exists for or in someone else, as in I hope in you, and we hope together. Hence, hope has a relational dimension, as it connects people through trust and shared purpose. In this sense, true hope points towards an openness to possibilities beyond the immediately imaginable. Through this openness, Marcel sees a sign of the human tendency towards something transcendent. Therefore, hope only makes sense if reality is more than a closed mechanical system. It suggests that being itself is trustworthy, that there is a benevolence at the heart of reality, as an affirmation of being over nothingness. It is not merely about getting through a difficulty, but about trusting that life has meaning which cannot be destroyed by failure, suffering, or death. Marcel is determined to show that hope is not a psychological trick to cope with hard times, nor is it reducible to rational expectation. It is a profound, active fidelity to life's meaning, grounded in trust in a reality that transcends present circumstances. His phenomenology describes how hope is experienced, whereas his metaphysics explains why hope is possible at all. In his own words, hope, on the contrary, aims at reunion, at recollection, at reconciliation. In that way, and that way alone, it might be called a memory of the future. Perhaps the philosopher you were hoping to hear about this evening was Ernst Bloch, the Marxist philosopher of hope, who stands out as one of the 20th century most distinctive voices in rethinking the relationship between utopia, human agency, and historical transformation. While phenomenology often focuses on the structures of lived experiences, Bloch guides our attention towards what is not yet, to the anticipatory consciousness that directs us towards possibilities still unrealized. Like Marcel, for Bloch, hope is not merely psychological comfort, but a fundamental ontological principle, embedded in reality itself as a tendency towards fulfillment. Instead of solely diagnosing the structures of the present, Bloch maintains that within every moment of incompletion lies the seed of a transformed future. His magnum opus, The Principle of Hope, published in 3 volumes in the 1950s, invites us to see human fragility not just as a condition to be endured, but as the very foundation from which utopian possibilities emerge. Like Husserl and Marcel, Bloch wrote during a period marked by world wars, political upheavals, and existential crises. His work responds to the widespread sense of crisis in modernity by placing hope at the core of human existence and historical development. In the introduction to his first volume, Bloch begins with the following. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? What are we waiting for? What awaits us? Many only feel confused. The ground shakes. They do not know why and with what. Theirs is a state of anxiety. If it becomes more definite, then it is fear. It is a question of learning hope. Its work does not renounce. It is in love with success rather than failure. Hope superior to fear is never passive like the latter, nor locked into nothingness. The emotion of hope goes out of itself, makes people broad instead of confining them. As previously noted, in moments of crisis, whether social, political, or personal, hope becomes especially vital. Instead of giving in to despair or resignation, Bloch views crisis as an opportunity where the future can be reimagined and transformed. While crisis exposes the contradictions and limitations of the present, hope acts as a motivating force to overcome crisis, inspiring creativity, resistance, and new forms of existence. For Bloch, hope is not a fleeting psychological state, but a fundamental ontological category. He uses these 2 distinct terms, the not yet conscious and the not yet become, to refer to the subjective and objective sides of hope. The not yet conscious refers to the anticipations, dreams, half-formed wishes, and imaginative impulses that exist within human consciousness, before they are clearly articulated or fully understood. We can think of it as the unawakened or prefigured awareness of possibilities. The not yet become refers to the possibilities embedded in the world and history that have not yet been realized. These are tendencies, potentials, or structures within reality itself that are waiting to come into being. In times of crisis, when the present appears fractured or exhausted, these 2 registers become especially significant, for they reveal that history is never a closed totality. Hope for Bloch arises from this dynamic interplay. It is neither escapist fantasy nor passive waiting, but the active recognition that within both consciousness and reality there lies a surplus, an unfinished remainder that can break open the present towards a transformed future. Thus, even at the heart of crisis, the not yet signals that the possible is already germinating within the real. Bloch also introduces the concept of concrete utopia, contrasting it with an abstract or escapist utopia. A concrete utopia is rooted in real possibilities emerging from present contradictions. It anticipates a better world based on the material conditions and aspirations of people. In turn, hope guides individuals to envision these concrete utopias. Utopian thinking is thus both realistic and revolutionary, essential for overcoming crises. In light of this, imagination is central to hope. Hence, it is imperative that we look at art, literature, and myth not as mere escapism. Rather, they are expressions of hope that reveal not yet possibilities. Hence, culture is a site of hope's awakening. Through creative works, people can explore and rehearse utopian futures. Moreover, hope is not solely individual, but collective and historical. It animates social movements, revolutions, and progressive change. In other words, historical progress depends on the hopeful anticipation of better conditions. Hope connects the past, present, and future in a dialectical process. And since I've stopped sharing artworks for some time now, here is The Endless Steps, a sculpture created by the Swiss artist Max Bill in 1991. According to the artist, these 19 winding steps, which stand nearly 10 meters high, represent Ernst Bloch's principle of hope. As the artwork seeks to show, Bloch's vision of hope is a future-oriented impulse that refuses to let the present have the final word. This vision, while rich in its utopian energy, remains largely framed within the horizon of history and human potential. In what came to be his final public address, titled The Right to Hope, delivered in 1965, a few months before his death, Paul Tillich explicitly begins with a nod to Bloch's work, recognizing in it a profound affirmation of the forward-moving nature of human existence. However, Tillich also extends this idea further. For him, hope is not merely a projection towards possible futures, but a participation in the transcendent ground of being. This shift moves the discussion from a purely imminent not yet to a hope grounded in an ultimate reality that can support us even when historical realization fails. A hope that is not just possible, but our right. Here, Tillich reflects on the essence and foundation of hope as a fundamental human orientation. As many before him, he starts by distinguishing hope from optimism and certainty. Optimism assumes favorable conditions, while hope persists even when circumstances appear hopeless. He insists that this anticipation must be rooted in something more than mere historical possibility. It must be anchored in the ground of being itself. For Tillich, the right to hope is rooted in our participation in this ultimate reality, which underpins existence and enables renewal despite failure, loss, or crisis. Hope in this sense is not a luxury or an optional sentiment. It is integral to our being. Without it, we risk falling into despair or resignation, but with it, we remain directed towards the ultimate fulfillment that surpasses any individual historical moment. But how then can we distinguish genuine hope from foolish hope? Foolish hope clings to unrealistic or arbitrary expectations, things that have no foundation in reality or in the deeper structure of being. It is wishful thinking, often ignoring the limits of a situation, and it can collapse when faced with reality. Genuine hope, on the other hand, is rooted in what Tillich calls the ground of being, as it participates in an ultimate reality that affirms the possibility of fulfillment even when immediate circumstances are bleak. Genuine hope does not guarantee that a particular desired outcome will occur. Instead, it guides us towards the ultimate meaning that can be realized through or despite events. Tillich's test is essentially this. If hope depends entirely on a specific finite outcome, it risks being foolish. If it is grounded in the inexhaustible depth of being, it remains genuine because it can survive the loss of any single expectation. Ultimately, for Tillich, genuine hope involves a posture of openness and waiting, as an active readiness for what may come, rather than a grasping for what we predefine must happen. This waiting is not passive resignation, but a receptive stance that trusts the ground of being to bring fulfillment in its own time and form. Openness frees us from the rigidity of fixed expectations, while waiting cultivates the patience to endure crisis without despair. Together, they protect hope from being foolish by anchoring it in the depth of reality rather than in the fragility of specific outcomes. Quoting from this short essay titled The Right to Hope by Tillich, he writes, "We hope for the fulfillment of our work, often against hope, because It is already in us as vision and driving force. We hope for a lasting love because we feel the power of this love present. But it is hope, not certainty. All powers of creation are in us and we are in them. We do not hope for us alone or for those alone who share our hope. We hope also for those who had and have no hope, for those whose hopes for this life remained unfulfilled, for those who are disappointed and indifferent, for those who despair of life, and even for those who have hurt or destroyed life. Tillich's vision of an all-encompassing and inclusive hope as an openness to the future grounded in the depth of being rather than in fixed outcomes, in my view, finds unexpected resonance in Hannah Arendt's reflections, especially in her work, The Human Condition. Arendt seems to share with Tillich the conviction that the future is not merely an extension of the present, but an open horizon in which the unexpected can break in. For Arendt, this openness takes concrete form in the human capacity for action and natality, the ability to initiate something new in the world. Let's not forget that Arendt wrote out of the ruins of the 20th century. A German Jewish intellectual, she fled Nazi Germany, lived in exile, and witnessed firsthand the collapse of political order and the rise of totalitarianism. For her, the crisis of her age was not only war and tyranny, but also the loss of a genuine public sphere, a space where people could act together, speak together, and shape a common world. When politics becomes nothing more than violence or bureaucracy, she warned, hope itself seems to vanish. In fact, Arendt locates the manifestation of hope in the political and communal sphere, where action and speech create new beginnings. Moving from Tillich to Arendt, we shift from the existential grounding of hope to its embodiment in the shared, unpredictable space of human affairs. For Arendt, hope lies in reclaiming the public sphere for genuine political action. In the face of crisis, the idea of natality is a profound source of hope. No matter how dire the situation, there is always the possibility of new beginnings. Arendt argues that faith and hope in human affairs stems from the fact that new people are continuously entering the world, each unique and capable of initiating new actions that may interrupt or divert the chains of events set in motion by previous actions. Moreover, since action is the political activity par excellence, natality and not mortality is the central notion within politics. Crisis for Arendt is never the end of the story, because human beings can always begin again. Every new person carries within them the possibility of disrupting the chain of events, of opening a future that was not inevitable. Hope for Arendt is grounded in our ability to act together in freedom, to create something new in the public realm. Even when institutions fail, even when politics collapses, this capacity for new beginning endures. A quote from the same work, Arendt writes, "The miracle that saves the world, the realm of human affairs, from its normal, natural ruin is ultimately the fact of natality, in which the faculty of action is ontologically rooted. It is, in other words, the birth of new men and the new beginning, the action they are capable of by virtue being born. Only the full experience of this capacity can bestow upon human affairs faith and hope, those two essential characteristics of human existence which Greek antiquity ignored altogether, discounting the keeping of faith as a very uncommon and not too important virtue, and counting hope among the evils of illusion in Pandora's box. It is this faith in and hope for the world that found perhaps its most glorious and most succulent expression in the few words with which the Gospels announce their glad tidings. A child has been born unto us." In reviewing so many voices on hope, I am very much aware of the risk of rushing, of picking out a few lines here and there without giving each thinker enough time to speak in their full depth, recognizing how each of these philosophers labored hard to open a world of thought and not just a few fleeting ideas. These philosophers, whose works span centuries, as we've seen, provides us with the depth and conceptual language to reflect on hope in the midst of crisis. I know I have only presented fragments of something much larger. If there is any value here, it lies not in my quick pace, but in the hope that some thread from these reflections might linger with you long after this talk ends. Before concluding, I'd like to turn to a few contemporary voices who bring the question of hope into our own era, illustrating how it resonates amid today's crises and opportunities. In her acclaimed book, Hope in the Dark, published in 2004, American writer and activist Rebecca Solnit highlights the often unseen effort of change. Writing in light of contemporary political and ecological crises, she argues that history is full of unpredictable turns, victories emerging from movements that once seemed hopeless. For Solnit, hope is not a promise of success, but a refusal to accept inevitability. It keeps open the possibility that even small acts of resistance can ripple outward in unpredictable ways. In times of crisis, this type of hope is modest yet defiant. It flourishes in uncertainty, sustaining action when outcomes remain unknown. Solnit draws on her experiences as a writer and activist, from recent events and history to advocate for hope even in dark times. She highlights how activism over the past 50 years had changed the world. This work provides new reasons for political engagement today. She points to historic victories, from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the Zapatista uprising, the protests in Seattle in 1999, the global marches against the Iraq War, and the Cancun protests in September 2003, as she traces the development of sophisticated, non-violent movements that unites diverse issues in our own century. In Hope Without Optimism, published in 2015, Terry Eagleton, a well-known English literary theorist, critic, and public intellectual, argues, under the influence of many thinkers I've mentioned today, that hope is distinct from naive optimism because it can persist even in the face of the inevitable loss. The example of offering water to a man trapped under a collapsing building illustrates precisely this. Hope does not deny the coming ruin, but insists on the dignity of compassion and resistance within it. For Eagleton, hope is a moral and political stance that acknowledges tragedy without capitulating to despair. It is the refusal to let inevitability exhaust our capacity for care, solidarity, and the struggle for what remains possible. Another significant recent publication on this theme, titled The Spirit of Hope, published in 2024, Byung-Chul Han, a South Korean-born philosopher and cultural theorist, warns that the contemporary cult of positivity, with its endless demand for self-optimization and cheerful affirmation, ends up eroding solidarity by individualizing struggle and suppressing negativity. Against this, he reclaims hope as a radically different force that resists the glossy optimism of the market, focusing instead on a shared anticipation of transformation. Hope, he writes, is the midwife of the new, a statement clearly echoing Hannah Arendt. And under the influence of Ernst Bloch, he affirms that hope is a collective opening toward what does not yet exist, born out of resistance to the pressure to merely cope and conform. It is through this openness to the not yet that genuine renewal and community can emerge. Finally, I believe it's apt to remind ourselves of Martin Luther King Jr., the great beacon light of hope of the last century, who spoke these words during a speech in Washington, D.C. in February 1968, just 2 months before he was assassinated. In my view, and the reason for bringing this as well, this statement beautifully sums up the message I'd like to share this evening, that at the end of the day, crises are temporary, but hope endures. In his famous speech, I Have a Dream, delivered in 1963, he spoke of how we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. This quote inspired the design of this memorial, which literally features the stone of hope emerging from the mountain of despair. As we have seen, philosophy teaches us that hope is not naive optimism, nor a passive longing for a better world. Rather, it is a conscious, active stance rooted in reason, virtue, and the possibility of transformation. Hope endures within uncertainty, blooms in shared struggle, and opens us to futures that do not yet exist. In confronting crises, both on a personal and social level, we are called not merely to survive, but to imagine, to act, and to trust in the irreducible potential of life. And listening to so many voices across history, from Augustine's City of God to Bloch's Principle of Hope, from Boethius' Prison Cell to Arendt's Vision of New Beginnings, philosophers have consistently insisted that crisis and hope are intimately linked. Crisis exposes our illusions, our fragility, our limits, but it also opens the door to courage, imagination, and renewal. Moreover, we have seen that hope is never a solitary act. It always gestures beyond the individual, towards something greater, a unity that sustains us when everything else fractures. But unity is not simple, because not all hopes align. Some hopes lift us up together. Others tear us apart. History is full of conflicting hopes. Hopes for domination, hopes for exclusion, for vengeance. The real work is to discern which hopes can we share, which hopes build communion rather than isolation. I see unity as a task we must take up daily, by orienting our hopes towards the common good, by listening across divides, by resisting the temptation to reduce hope to a private wish fulfillment. I also recognize this unity not only as an ethical or political ideal, but also as a participation in the very life of God, who is communion, who is love, and as Paul in the first century writes to the Ephesians, for he himself is our peace, who has made the two one, and has torn down the dividing wall of hostility. And yet, we live in an age obsessed with building walls. Walls on borders, walls between rich and poor, walls of ideology, even digital walls that keep us in echo chambers. Today, just as before, crisis tempts us towards fragmentation, towards despair, towards a loss of trust in one another. The question then is whether we will allow these crises to scatter us into isolation, or whether we will let them call us into deeper unity. Can we hope together, not merely for ourselves, but for each other? Can we find in our differences not reasons for suspicion, but reasons for communion? Moreover, can we find the seeds of hopeful futures within all this? Can we still believe with Kant that reason and morality give us grounds for hope? With Arendt, that every birth is a new beginning? With Bloch, that the not yet beats within history itself? Or have we grown too weary, as Husserl warned us, to believe in the possibility of being renewed, and in turn renew the world? Perhaps the deeper question is this: when despair surrounds us, what does it generally mean to live as if hope endures? Not as mere optimism, but as a persistent act of faith in life, in each other, and in the potential for transformation. In a time when despair is easy and the vision is tempting, how will we live as if unity, though fragile, difficult, but real, is still worth hoping for? What if hope is not something we wait for, but something we practice, through courage in the face of uncertainty, through solidarity when the world fractures, through everyday small acts of renewal that defy the logic of inevitability. But how can we speak about hope when confronted with atrocities and deep injustice? When we speak about hope in the face of genocide, we must be very clear. Hope is not denial. It does not erase injustice or soften the horror of suffering. To hope in this context cannot mean pretending that things are fine or that peace will magically appear tomorrow. Philosophically, hope means refusing to accept despair as the last word, even when history seems bent towards destruction. Hope is inseparable from justice. Hope does not mean passive waiting. It calls us into solidarity, into action, into working for reconciliation when hatred seems absolute. We can hope and work for the protection of innocent lives, for justice for the oppressed, for the courage of peacemakers to refuse to dehumanize the other, for reconciliation that may take generations, but begins in small acts of mercy now. This hope does not guarantee success, it guarantees only that despair will never have the final word. To abandon hope is to abandon the victims to meaninglessness. To cling to hope is to insist that their suffering calls us to something more, to a unity we cannot yet see, but must dare to believe is possible. In our fractured age, this unity takes the form of building bridges across divisions, caring for the vulnerable, and protecting the earth we share. They are the seeds of the hope we most desperately need today. And if we choose not to hope, what then becomes of our capacity to act, to imagine, to resist despair's finality? Ultimately, crisis demands our response, but hope calls for our creativity. It questions whether we will leave the future to chance, or, even amid the shadows of uncertainty, we will dare to shape it. To work for reconciliation, to care for creation, to refuse to let hatred define our communities, these are the real forms unity can take today. Our hope is not for a perfect world, but for a reconciled one. Not a world without conflict, but a world where conflict doesn't have the final word. Not a perfect harmony, but a fragile, lived communion that testifies to something greater than ourselves. Our hope is that, even in a fractured world, love has the final word.